I thought after 4 decades together. Nothing could surprise me anymore. Then Elaine looked up from her holiday checklist and said, "Daniel, maybe you sit this one out. It'll be calmer. No yelling, no fight, just a decision everyone had apparently agreed on except me." I set my mug down and realized I hadn't been invited into my own family in a long time. Elaine didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. She stood by the counter, arms folded, like she was reading from a list she'd already rehearsed in her head. "You interrupt people. Daniel," she said it calmly, almost gently. "You correct them. You make things tense." I waited. There was more. "At dinner, you always have to point out what won't work. At family gatherings, you turn everything into a debate. People feel like they're being examined. People. Not me. People." Lucas had his own version. He said I didn't believe in him, that every time he talked about a new idea, something bold, something different, I was the first one to poke holes in it, that I asked questions no one else asked, that I made him feel small. He didn't say it angrily. He said it like a conclusion he'd already reached. Hannah didn't accuse me of anything directly. She just looked tired. She said she was exhausted from playing referee, from translating my words so they wouldn't land too hard, from smoothing things over before someone got offended. And that was the file. The case against me. I didn't interrupt. I didn't argue. Not because I disagreed with everything, but because I recognized the shape of what they were doing. They weren't describing actions anymore. They were describing a label. Difficult. That word has a way of ending conversations before they start. Once it's attached to you, nothing you say sounds neutral again. Every sentence becomes evidence. I'll admit this much. I don't sugarcoat things. If someone asks me what I think, I answer, if an idea has holes, I point them out. Not to win, not to dominate, but because I've seen what happens when no one does. What I didn't say out loud was this: at what point did honesty become hostility? When did noticing details turn into a character flaw? When did experience start being treated like an inconvenience? They weren't wrong about one thing. I don't just nod along. I don't clap politely when something sounds exciting but collapses under scrutiny. I don't stay quiet just to keep the room comfortable. And that, apparently, made me hard to be around. But here's the part no one said directly. They didn't call me difficult because I was cruel. They called me difficult because I didn't disappear, because I didn't slowly shrink myself into background noise, because I didn't learn the art of smiling through things I knew would go wrong. There's a difference between being negative and being the last person in the room still paying attention. Sometimes the person everyone labels difficult is just the one who remembers what happened the last time. The one who says, "We tried this before." The one who asks, "Have we thought this through?" The one who refuses to confuse enthusiasm with preparation. It's easier to call that person a problem than to admit the room doesn't want another perspective. Because listening takes effort, and agreement feels like peace. So you tell yourself a story. You say they're rigid, out of touch, stuck in their ways. You don't have to wrestle with what they're saying anymore. You just dismiss who they are. Sitting there, hearing it laid out like that, I realized something that hurt more than the accusations. No one was actually asking if I was right or wrong. They were asking if I could be quieter, if I could make myself smaller, if I could stop being a friction point in their lives. That's when it hit me. The problem wasn't that I challenged ideas. The problem was that I still had ideas at all. And somewhere along the way, the family had quietly agreed that it would be easier if I didn't. It didn't happen all at once. No one stood up and said, "Daniel, your opinion no longer matters." That would have been easier to fight. Instead, it happened quietly, over years, in rooms I'd already walked into 1,000 times. I tried to remember the last time someone argued with me directly. Really argued, not nodded politely, not changed the subject. It had been a while. What replaced it sounded considerate. Let us handle it. Don't worry about this one. Dad, you don't need to stress yourself. They said it with smiles, with soft voices, sometimes with a hand on my arm, like reassurance. But what they were really doing was deciding who still got a role. At first, I didn't notice. I thought it was just age, kids growing up, lives getting busier. Then I noticed the pattern. I'd start a sentence. Someone else would finish it for me, or redirect it before it landed. I'd offer a thought. It wouldn't be rejected. It would just drift past. Like I hadn't spoken at all. That's the part people don't talk about. You expect power to be taken with noise, with shouting, with control, with force. But there's another kind. Quieter, polite, almost invisible. No one tells you to stop speaking. They just stop listening. In psychology, they call it soft removal, not stripping someone of presence, but of relevance. You're still invited, still seated at the table, still included in the photo, but the decisions happen without you. You're consulted last. If at all, I wasn't angry because they thought I was wrong. I can handle being wrong. I was angry because they didn't think I was necessary. There's a difference. Being challenged means you still matter. Being bypassed means you don't. I started noticing it in small things. The way conversations sped up when I paused. The way plans were already finalized by the time I heard about them. The way my questions were met with, "It's already taken care of." Already. That word started showing up a lot. It's amazing how quickly a person can become background noise without anyone meaning harm. Elaine thought she was keeping things smooth. Lucas thought he was being efficient. Hannah thought she was protecting everyone from conflict. No villains, just a system quietly rearranging itself. And I was the piece that no longer fit. What hurt wasn't the silence itself. It was the story behind it. The unspoken assumption that I was finished growing, that my role had been completed, that whatever I still had to say was more likely to slow things down than help. I'd spent my life solving problems that only showed themselves after years of neglect, cracks that formed quietly, failures that didn't announce themselves until it was too late. And now, inside my own family, the same thing was happening. They thought they were choosing peace. What they were really choosing was convenience. Silence feels calm when you're not the one being erased by it. There's a moment I remember clearly. We were in the living room. Lucas was explaining a plan. Big words, big confidence. I asked one question, just one. No one snapped at me. No one told me to stop. Elaine jumped in instead. "Let's not get into all that right now." And just like that, the room moved on. That's when I understood. No one had banned my voice. They'd just learned how to work around it. I wasn't losing arguments. I wasn't being overruled. I was being skipped. That's a strange kind of loneliness. Being surrounded by people who love you while slowly becoming optional. You start to doubt yourself. You wonder if maybe they're right. Maybe you are just noise now. And the most dangerous part, you begin to cooperate with it. You stop insisting. Stop clarifying. Stop finishing sentences. Not because you have nothing to say, but because you've learned how exhausting it is to say it into a room that's already moved on. That's when silence stops being peaceful. That's when it becomes a kind of quiet eviction. No paperwork, no confrontation, just a chair that's still there, but no longer meant for you. By 9:30 that night, Elaine had gone upstairs to pack. I stayed in the kitchen long enough to hear the zipper close, long enough to hear a drawer open and shut. Then I stood up and walked toward the back door. The garage light switch was right there on the wall. I flipped it, and the room came alive in the same dull yellow it always had. That garage had been ours for years. but it never really belonged to anyone except me. Elaine called it clutter. Lucas called it a fire hazard. Hannah called it Dad's cave, like it was a joke. It wasn't a cave. It was the last place in the house where my hands still meant something. The air smelled like sawdust and old cardboard, motor oil, dried paint, and the faint metal smell of tools that haven't been moved in a while. I shut the door behind me. Not dramatically, just enough to stop the house from swallowing the sound of my breathing. Against the far wall was a workbench I'd built myself, back when Lucas was still in high school. The top was scarred with cuts and burn marks from a lifetime of fixing things that other people gave up on. On that bench, under a gray tarp, was the reason I'd been spending so many hours out here. I didn't rip the tarp off like a reveal. I folded it back slowly, like I was handling something fragile. Underneath were three things: a binder, a thick spiral notebook, and a small physical model made of foam board and thin wooden slats. The binder looked boring. It was labeled with plain black tape: Sac River, roadways. Inside were printouts, maps, tables, charts, not the kind of stuff you frame or brag about. The spiral notebook was older, not ancient, but worn. The pages were soft at the edges from being flipped too many times. And the model. The model looked like a child's science project if you didn't know what you were looking at. A strip of river, a raised line that represented a levee, little marks where roadways sat close to the water, colored pins stuck in at odd angles. To anyone else, it was junk. To me, it was a language. I ran my hand over the model and stopped on one of the pins. Red. That meant failure point. There were too many red pins. I'd started all of this after a winter storm 2 years ago. Nothing dramatic happened to our street. No headlines, no viral footage. But I watched the local news that night, and they showed a stretch of road outside town that had buckled after flooding. A 2-lane road. One of those roads you don't notice until it's gone. The reporter called it unexpected. I didn't buy that word. Infrastructure doesn't fail unexpectedly. It fails quietly. Then it fails all at once. I'd worked long enough in public projects to know how it really goes. One department has the data, another has the budget, another has the responsibility, and no one has the full picture at the same time. So things get delayed, messages get lost, a warning gets filed under the wrong category. A contractor measures one way, an inspector reads another way. A small issue becomes expensive. An expensive issue becomes dangerous. Most people think the problem is money. Sometimes it is. But a lot of times the problem is coordination. Not because people are stupid, because the system is fractured. And that's what I'd been working on in here. Not some flashy app, not a gadget, a way to make information speak the same language before the water rises. I'd taken publicly available data floodplain maps, maintenance schedules, traffic load reports, inspection notes, and built a framework around it, a way to translate it, a way to flag patterns that don't look urgent until you connect them. I didn't tell Elaine because I could already hear the tone. That's nice. Daniel, are you keeping busy? Just don't get obsessed. I didn't tell Lucas because he'd make it into a punchline. Dad's building his little project, like it was a hobby, like it was model trains. And I didn't tell Hannah because she'd try to be kind. But kindness can still be dismissive when it comes with a smile that says, "I'm humoring you." So I kept it here, in the garage, in the shed behind the garage when I needed more space. Not because I was hiding something illegal or shameful, because I was protecting the last part of myself that didn't need anyone's permission. I opened the notebook to a page I knew by heart. The handwriting was mine, smaller than it used to be, but steady. Boxes, arrows, notes in the margins. Little reminders like check field report format, confirm inspection intervals. Don't assume the data lines up. It wasn't pretty, it was work. The kind of work you do when you still believe details matter, even if no one claps for them. On the bottom shelf, my laptop sat next to a tape measure and a small box of nails. That combination would have looked ridiculous to anyone else. To me, it made perfect sense. Because the thing I'd been building wasn't just digital, it was practical. A bridge between what's written down and what's actually happening out there. I sat on the old stool by the workbench and listened for a moment. The house was quiet again. Quiet the way it gets when everyone's already moved on. In here, I wasn't difficult. I wasn't too much. I wasn't a problem to manage. I was just a man with a set of tools and a mind that still worked. And as I stared at those red pins on that model, I realized something else. If the people closest to me could look at this garage and see only clutter, what else had they been looking at in me and calling it junk? I closed the binder and slid it back under the tarp. Not because I was ashamed, because I wasn't ready for them to touch it yet. Not until it could speak loud enough that nobody could pretend they hadn't heard it. 3 days after that kitchen conversation, I met Mark Ellison for coffee. It was one of those places near the freeway that tries to look rustic. Exposed wood, tin signs, the smell of burnt espresso, the kind of place where people talk about big plans in a small room. Mark was already there, hunched over his phone, tapping like he was trying to win an argument with it. He looked up when I walked in. He smiled. But it didn't reach his eyes. "Daniel," he said, and stood to shake my hand. His grip was firm. His shoulders were tense. We'd worked together years ago, back when I was still in the field and not just a name on paperwork. Mark had been the kind of guy who could walk onto a site and know within 5 minutes where the problem was. Smart, practical, a little impatient with nonsense. He waited until I sat down before he spoke. "I'm going to say something," he said. "And you're going to hate me for it. I'm already having a great week," I said. He gave a short laugh. Then he slid his phone across the table. On the screen was a photo of a washed-out shoulder of highway north of Sacramento. Mud everywhere, orange cones, a crew standing around looking helpless. "Look familiar?" he asked. "It looks expensive," I said. "That's the problem." He said, "Everything looks expensive after it breaks." He leaned back and rubbed his forehead like he was trying to push the pressure out of his skull. "People think the crisis is funding," he said. "And sure, funding is part of it. But half the mess we're in isn't because nobody cares." He paused. "It's because nobody can coordinate." He said it like it was a diagnosis. "You've got contractors working off one set of drawings," he continued. "Inspectors working off another. Safety teams using their own reports. Weather data sitting in one system. Maintenance records sitting in another." He started counting on his fingers, like he needed to prove it to himself. "And then the city has a spreadsheet. The county has a dashboard. The state has a portal that crashes twice a week. Everyone's tracking the same project, but they're not speaking the same language." He looked at me. "So, what happens?" he asked. "Delays, rework, accidents? And when something goes wrong, everyone points at everyone else and says, 'Well, I didn't know.'" I didn't answer right away. Not because I didn't understand, because I did. I'd lived my whole career inside that exact sentence. Mark took a sip of his coffee and grimaced. "We have good people," he said. "Really good people. Engineers, analysts, field supervisors. Not idiots, not slackers." He tapped the table with 2 fingers. "But they're tripping over each other because the system is fractured." And then he said the line that made me sit up. "It's not that we don't have talent," Mark said. "It's that we don't have a common language." He said it simply, like it wasn't a big thought, but it was. Because I'd been carrying that idea around for years without calling it by name. A common language, not buzzwords, not an app with a shiny interface. A language, a way for the field to talk to the office without losing meaning. A way for a safety note to matter to a planner. A way for a weather alert to reach the person who actually needs to hear it. Mark watched my face change and narrowed his eyes. What he asked? Nothing. I said, "It came out too fast." He leaned forward. "No," he said. "That wasn't nothing. That was you recognizing something." I looked down at the phone again, at the broken roadway, at the mud, at the men standing around waiting for instructions that would arrive too late. I thought about the binder in my garage, the red pins on my model, the notebooks full of arrows and boxes. Mark didn't know any of that. To him, I was just an older guy he used to work with. One more retired name in a long list of people who used to matter in meetings. He kept talking. And the more he talked, the more the pieces in my head started clicking into place. "We waste months," he said, "because someone documents something in a format nobody else can use, or someone flags a risk, and it gets buried under 10 other emails." He shook his head. "We're drowning in information. Daniel," he said, "and we're starving for clarity." That phrase stuck. Drowning in information, starving for clarity. I could almost see it. All those separate systems like islands, all those smart people yelling across water, thinking they were being heard. Mark sat back again. "I'm consulting now," he said. "Small firms, county projects, a couple state contractors. And I'll tell you what's scary." He lowered his voice, even though no one was listening. "Everyone is building their own little solution, their own dashboard, their own workaround. Everyone thinks they're fixing the problem." He gave a humorless smile. "They're just building more islands." I didn't realize I'd clenched my jaw until it started to ache. He looked at me for a long moment, then said, "You ever work on anything like this?" Back in the day, I could have lied. I could have shrugged and said, "Not really." That would have been the easier answer, the safer answer. Because once you admit you still have something to contribute, you invite disappointment again. You invite people to laugh, to dismiss, to tell you it's cute. But Mark wasn't Elaine. He wasn't Lucas. He wasn't Hannah. He wasn't asking to manage me. He was asking because he needed an answer. So I took a slow breath. "Years ago," I said, "we had a coordination method, not software, not AI, just a discipline." Mark's eyes stayed on me. "A discipline," I repeated. "Rules for how information moves, how it's labeled, who signs off, what gets escalated, what gets translated, what doesn't get ignored." He didn't interrupt. That alone felt strange. I kept going. "It wasn't glamorous," I said, "but it worked because it forced people to speak the same language, same definitions, same thresholds, same timing." Mark stared at me like he was trying to decide if I was serious. "Daniel," he said slowly, "do you still have it?" I hesitated. Not because I didn't, because I wasn't used to someone asking like it mattered, in pieces. I said. He nodded once, like he'd just heard the first honest thing all week. "Then you're sitting on the kind of thing people pretend they want," he said, "until they realize it changes how they work." I didn't smile. I didn't make a joke. I looked out the window at the parking lot and watched a man load a ladder into the back of a truck. I thought about my family upstairs, packing without me. I thought about the garage, the tarp, the model, the binder, and I realized something that scared me a little. The problem Mark was describing wasn't theoretical. It was real. It was urgent. And for the first time in a long time, someone outside my house was speaking my language. Mark slid his phone back into his pocket. "If you ever want to talk through it," he said, "I know people, not hype people, real people, the kind who fund solutions because they're tired of cleaning up disasters." He stood, left a few bills on the table, and pulled his jacket on. Then he paused, like he was choosing his words carefully. "Don't let them convince you you're done," he said. And he walked out. I stayed seated. The coffee had gone cold, my hands were steady, but something in me had shifted. Because in that one conversation, Mark didn't treat me like a complication to be managed. He treated me like a missing piece. And once you feel that, even once it's hard to go back to being invisible, Mark's words stayed with me longer than the coffee taste did. I drove home the long way, past the river, past the low spots where the road dips and the asphalt always looks darker after rain. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't call anyone. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the house was lit up like a postcard. The wreath was on the door. The string lights were blinking along the gutters. Elaine had been doing that for years, even when nobody noticed. I walked inside and set my keys in the bowl by the entryway. The bowl was ceramic. Elaine's choice. My choice had been a dish I could throw my keys into without thinking. The hallway smelled like pine cleaner and cinnamon. Holiday smells, the kind that are supposed to mean warmth. Elaine was upstairs. I could hear the drawer slides, suitcase wheels. Soft, controlled noise. The house wasn't angry. That was the strange part. There was no yelling, no slammed doors, no accusations flying back and forth like knives, just movement, just decisions. I stood in the living room and looked at the tree. It was already decorated, lights, ornaments, a star on top. It looked correct, like a family that had everything under control. I poured myself a glass of water and drank it standing up. Then I walked to the window and watched the street. A neighbor was loading gifts into the back of an SUV. A kid ran out in socks, carrying wrapping paper, laughing like the cold didn't matter. I should have felt angry. I should have felt humiliated, or at least dramatic. Instead, I felt something quieter. Relief. Because for the first time in a long time, nobody was watching me for the wrong tone. Nobody was waiting for me to ruin a moment with an opinion. Nobody was going to sigh when I spoke. That relief scared me a little. Elaine came downstairs around 8, carrying a bag. She stopped when she saw me, like she'd forgotten I would still be in my own house. "Lucas is picking me up in the morning," she said. "Okay," I said. She looked at me for a beat, like she was waiting for an argument. I didn't give her one. She nodded once and walked back toward the kitchen. And that was it. No goodbye speech, no last-minute softness, just a schedule being followed. At 6:12, the next morning, a car door closed outside, then another. I watched from the hallway as the taillights moved down the street. The house felt bigger the second they were gone. By 7, I was alone. I made coffee the way I always did. 2 scoops, water to the line. The same mug, chipped at the rim. I sat at the kitchen table, the same place where Elaine had told me to stay home, and I listened. No footsteps overhead, no fridge opening and closing, no voice from the other room asking if I'd seen the phone charger. Just the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the tick of the clock on the wall. The clock had a second hand that clicked loudly. Elaine had bought it because she said it made the house feel alive. It didn't feel alive. It felt like an empty building that still has power. Around noon, I made a sandwich, turkey, mustard, bread toasted too long because no one was talking to me while I watched it. I ate it at the counter. Then I went to the garage. I worked for hours. Not because I was avoiding my feelings, because the work didn't judge me. In the garage, I didn't have to soften my words. I didn't have to perform calm. I didn't have to pretend I didn't see problems before they happened. I checked a set of data points against an inspection schedule and caught a mismatch. A small thing, The kind of small thing that becomes a headline when it's ignored long enough. I wrote it down in my notebook. I adjusted a rule in my framework. I tested it again. And in that repetition, something settled in me. Not happiness, something closer to oxygen. Evening came without ceremony. I turned on one lamp in the living room. I didn't bother with the overhead lights. The tree blinked quietly in the corner like it was trying to keep me company. I sat on the couch with my laptop on my knees, and the house around me felt like it was holding its breath. I realized, in that moment, why families can go years without exploding. Because silence is easy to mistake for peace. When nobody argues, you assume everything is fine. When nobody complains, you assume everyone is okay. When nobody pushes back, you assume you've finally fixed the tension. But silence isn't always peace. Sometimes it's surrender. Sometimes it's one person learning the safest way to survive the room is to stop speaking in it. I'd been doing that slowly, without admitting it. One comment I didn't make at dinner. One opinion I swallowed to avoid the sigh. One correction I kept to myself because I didn't want to be the reason the air changed. Over time, you stop noticing you're shrinking. You just notice the room feels calmer. It's calm because there's less of you in it. That night, I stood in the hallway and looked at the family photos. Elaine and me at Lake Tahoe, years ago. Lucas in a cap and gown. Hannah with her first apartment keys. Pictures of a life that looked full. I touched the frame with 2 fingers, then let my hand fall. I went to bed early, not because I was tired, but because there was nothing to stay awake for. The bedroom was too neat. Elaine had made it that way. Pillows lined up, blanket tucked in. I lay on my side and stared at the ceiling. No one was mad at me. No one was disappointed in me. And for a few minutes, that felt like relief. Then it felt like something else. Like a room with the door closed, the windows shut, the air perfectly still. No wind, no noise, no conflict. And slowly, without anyone noticing, not enough oxygen. I took a breath and held it for a second, then let it out. Because I understood something I hadn't wanted to say out loud. I hadn't stopped arguing because I ran out of fire. I'd stopped because I was trying not to burn down what was left of my place in the family. And now, sitting alone in the quiet I'd been trained to call peace, I could finally hear the truth underneath it. This wasn't calm. This was absence. It happened at 12:07 I know because I was awake, staring at the same crack in the ceiling I'd stared at for years. The house was quiet in that clean, sealed way. No wind, no footsteps, no voices. My phone buzzed once on the nightstand. Then again. Then a third time. Close enough together that it stopped feeling like a mistake. I reached over and picked it up. The first notification wasn't a call. It was an email. Subject line, Notice of Intent to Award, State of California. I blinked at it like it was written in another language. I sat up, turned on the lamp, and opened it. It wasn't a congratulations email. It wasn't warm. It was stiff. Legal. Numbers and timelines, a pilot program, infrastructure data management, compliance, reporting, integration across districts. And then the line that made my thumb stop moving. A contract amount? 7 figures. More than any hobby in my garage was supposed to touch. My stomach didn't drop like I'd won the lottery. It dropped like I'd just heard something heavy land in the next room. A second email came in right after, an industry bulletin. A dry write-up that sounded like it had been written by someone who didn't know my face. It mentioned my name. Not as a father, not as a husband, as a vendor, as a solution. I read the words twice. Slow. I didn't feel proud. I felt exposed. like someone had pulled open the curtain on the part of my life everyone had agreed not to see. My phone buzzed again. A text from Mark Ellison. "Check your inbox." They moved faster than I thought. I stared at the message. Then I looked at the clock again. 12, Ma? The house was still the same. The tree still blinked in the living room. The dishwasher still hummed. But something had shifted anyway. I set the phone down and just sat there on the edge of the bed. No fist pump, no speech, just the weight of it. Because I knew what this kind of email does. It doesn't just change a project, it changes the way people look at you. At 12:19, my phone rang. Lucas. He never called after midnight unless something was wrong. I answered on the second ring. "Dad," he said. And his voice didn't sound like Lucas. It sounded smaller, like a kid who just opened the wrong door. "Yeah," I said. Did you get an email I didn't ask how he knew?" "I already did." "Yeah," I said again. A pause. "I'm looking at it right now." He said, This is real. It's real." I said, "How long have you been working on this?" he asked. He said it like he was asking how long I'd been keeping a secret family. I stared at the lamplight pooling on the nightstand. "A while," I said. Another pause. "Dad," the number he started. "It's a contract." I cut in. My voice stayed calm. "Not a scratch ticket." "I know," he said quickly. "I know, He didn't know what to do with it. Lucas had always been good with big talk. Plans, pitches, next steps. But he didn't have a script for this. "Dad," he said again. "Why didn't you tell us I let that sit in the air? Because I could have said, you wouldn't have listened. I could have said, you were busy calling me difficult. I could have said 100 things that would have sounded like revenge. I didn't. Where are you, I asked. At the ranch, he said. Elaine's asleep. Hannah's in the guest room. I'm sitting in the kitchen. I pictured it, the same kitchen table where decisions got made without me. So you're reading it at the same place you all decided I shouldn't come. I said. He went quiet. That's not what this is, he said. I almost laughed, but it didn't come out. Lucas, I said, I didn't do this to make a point, I know, he said, but he didn't sound sure. Another vibration came in while we were on the call. A third email, attachment link, a scheduled briefing date, a list of deliverables. The state didn't care how my family felt about me. The state cared if the bridge reports matched the inspection logs, if the floodgate data synced before the rain hit, if the right people saw the right information before something failed. That was the thing I'd been trying to say for years. It was never about fancy tech. It was about discipline, about one language everyone has to speak, so the smartest people in the room don't cancel each other out. Lucas cleared his throat on the line. Dad, he said, we thought you were down in the garage tinkering. Tinkering, I repeated, like I was tasting the word. Dad, I'm serious, he said. This is huge. Here it was. The moment I'd imagined in my head before I ever wrote a single line of code. The moment where they'd finally look at me without that patient tone. And it didn't feel like victory. It felt late. I took a breath and looked around my bedroom. The closet door, Elaine's side of the bed untouched, the suitcase marks still on the carpet where she'd rolled it out. Lucas, I said, listen, No. I said, really listen. He didn't interrupt. I kept my voice even. Just take a second and ask yourself something. I said, if that email hadn't come in tonight, if there wasn't a contract amount attached to my name, would you be calling me right now? Silence. I heard him shift in his chair on the other end. A faint clink, like a spoon hitting a mug. He started. That's not a trap. I said, it's a real question. He exhaled. I don't know, he said finally. I want to say yes. But was the honest part. I let it land. Because that was the point that hurt. Not that they didn't believe I could build something. That they didn't care to look until there was a price tag big enough to force attention. Dad, Lucas said again. Quieter. I'm sorry. I didn't answer right away. Not because I wanted him to suffer. Because I didn't want his apology to be a reaction to a number. I wanted it to be a reaction to a person. I'm tired, I said. You should be, he said. No, I said. Not physically. He didn't speak. I'll talk to you tomorrow. I said, Dad, tomorrow. I repeated. I ended the call and set the phone down. Then I sat there in the small circle of lamplight, staring at my hands. I wasn't happy. I wasn't angry. I was just done pretending this was about money. Outside, the new day had already started. Inside, the same old silence filled the room. Only now, the silence had a subject line. Elaine came back the next afternoon. I heard her before I saw her. Keys. A pause at the door. The soft drag of her boots across the mat like she didn't want to make noise. When she stepped into the hallway, her eyes were red, not dramatic red, tired red. She held her phone out like it was hot. Daniel, she said, and the word came out thin. Why didn't you tell me I was at the kitchen sink? Hands in soap. A coffee mug I didn't need to wash. Just something to do. I didn't know you wanted to hear it. I said. She flinched like I'd raised my voice. That's not fair, she said. I'm your wife. I dried my hands on a dish towel. Slow. I didn't turn it into a speech. I know what you are, I said. I also know what it's been like. She took a step closer. Her shoulders were up, like she'd been carrying something heavy from the ranch all night. We didn't mean she started. I held up my hand. Not sharp, just enough. Tell me something, I said. When was the last time you asked what I was working on? Because you were curious. She opened her mouth, then stopped. Not because she didn't understand the question, because she did. The kitchen was quiet, no TV, no chatter, just the fridge clicking on and off. I didn't think it was real. She said, I know. I said, she swallowed. I thought it was one of your projects, she said. And every time you talked about it. Lucas rolled his eyes and Hannah got that look like she was bracing for an argument. I didn't want another fight. There it was. Not hate, not cruelty, just the decision to keep things smooth. Smooth is expensive. I leaned back against the counter and watched her. Elaine wiped under her eye with the back of her hand, like she was annoyed at herself for crying. I didn't want to hurt you, she said. I'm not hurt because you didn't clap. I said. She looked up, confused. I'm hurt because you stopped seeing me. I said, those are different things. She shook her head quickly, like she could shake the thought off. That's not true, she said. I see you. I didn't argue. I walked to the table and pulled out a chair. The same table where she'd said, stay home for everyone's sake. I sat down. Elaine, I said, last night you drove back here because of an email. Her face tightened. You think I came because of the money? She said. I think you came because the world outside this house finally called me valuable. I said, and that scared you. She stared at me. I kept my voice level. Not scared I'd leave. I said, Scared you'd missed the last few years and wouldn't be able to explain why. Her jaw trembled once. That's not what I want, she said. I want my husband. I nodded, like I believed her. Because I did. But belief isn't the same as trust. I'm still here, I said. I've been here the whole time. She sat down across from me, the same spot she'd used like a witness stand when she listed my faults. Her hands were clasped tight, white knuckles. I thought I was protecting the family, she whispered. From what I asked. She looked away, from tension. She said, from you and Lucas, from everyone walking on eggshells. I let the word eggshell sit there. Do you know what it feels like? I said. To be treated like the problem, just for having an opinion. She looked back at me. Her eyes didn't fight. They listened. I kept going. People think respect is something you earn like a prize. I said, like if you hit the right numbers, you get it. If you don't, you don't. Elaine's breathing hitched. That's not how she started. I'm not accusing you. I said, I'm describing what happens. I leaned forward, elbows on the table. In the world we live in, I said, we hand our attention to winners. We listen louder when someone has a headline. We treat quiet people like background noise until a spotlight finds them. She stared at her hands. And then we say, I didn't know, I said. As if not knowing is neutral. Elaine's shoulders shook once. I didn't know. She said again, softer. That's the point. I said, I let the silence do the work. Then I said it plainly. Respect isn't a reward. I said, it's the minimum standard for a relationship to stay human. Elaine pressed her lips together like she was trying not to fall apart. I didn't stop respecting you, she whispered. I looked at her for a long second. Then why did it feel like my voice had to come with a contract attached, I said, before anyone wanted to hear it. Her eyes filled again. I'm sorry, she said. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't pretty. It was honest. I didn't jump in and comfort her right away. Not because I wanted to punish her, because I needed her to understand this wasn't solved by a sentence. She reached across the table like she wanted to take my hand. I didn't pull away, but I didn't lean in, either. Daniel, she said, tell me what you need. I took a breath. I need you to stop managing me. I said, stop translating me. Stop smoothing me down so everyone stays comfortable. She nodded quickly. I can do that, she said, and I need you to hear this part. I said, if the only reason people are back in my orbit is because my market value went up, her face tightened at the phrase, then I don't want it. I said, I would rather be alone than be suddenly interesting. Elaine's mouth opened, then closed. You don't mean that, she said. I mean it, I said. Because I've lived the other version? She looked at me. Really looked. What other version, she asked. The version where I sit in the garage and become smaller? I said, where my ideas get treated like clutter, where my words get treated like noise. I paused. That's a slow kind of disappearing. I said, and I'm not doing it anymore. Elaine's chin lifted a little. So what now, she asked. I held her gaze. Now you ask. I said, not because you're scared, not because the state sent an email, because you actually want to know. She blinked. What do I ask, she said. I didn't smile. I didn't soften it. I gave her the simplest thing. Ask me what I'm building, I said. And when I answer, don't rush to make it harmless. Elaine nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. Okay, she whispered. What are you building? I looked at her, and for the first time in a long time, the question didn't feel like a formality. It felt like a door. 2 weeks later. I was sitting in a room I never thought I'd step into again. A state office building in downtown Sacramento. Fluorescent lights, bad carpet, coffee that tasted like cardboard. There was a long table, a projector, and a stack of printed agendas with too many acronyms. Elaine sat beside me, Lucas on my other side, restless, checking his phone like the screen could explain what was happening. Hannah sat a little back, quiet, taking in faces more than words. I wore the same boots I wore in the garage. No one in that room knew what those boots had stood in. They didn't know the late nights. They didn't know the splinters from the shed door. They didn't know the way a man learns to go silent just to stay in the house. They just knew there was a pilot contract on the table. A woman at the front clicked to the first slide. "Thank you for coming," she said. Voice professional, polite. "We're here to align on implementation." Align? That word always meant one thing. Someone was about to find out how messy reality is. I watched the room while she spoke. People in crisp shirts, younger faces, lanyards, a few contractors with sunburned necks and hands that looked like they still touched tools, and then I saw them. 3 people near the back, standing together like they'd come as a unit. Late 20s, maybe early 30s. Clean haircuts, new laptops, the kind of confidence that comes from never being ignored. The man in the middle glanced toward the front, then turned and scanned the room. His eyes landed on me. He froze for half a second. Not long enough for anyone else to notice. Long enough for me to recognize him. I didn't remember his name right away. I remembered his smile. 5 years ago, it had been a conference room in San Jose. A future of infrastructure panel with good lighting and empty promises. I'd been invited last minute, an older guy from the public side, there to talk about what fails in the field when the shiny systems hit real weather and real deadlines. I had my notes on paper. They had tablets. I stood up during Q&A and said something simple. If every contractor logs the same thing a different way, I said, you don't have a data problem. You have a discipline problem. A few people nodded. That group in the back didn't. They exchanged looks like I'd just told them to use a fax machine. One of them, him, leaned toward his friend and whispered, not even trying to hide it. That's kind of old school, like it was an insult. I remember walking out into the lobby afterward, past the sponsor banners, past the espresso stand, feeling my age like a jacket that didn't fit anymore. I didn't argue. I didn't chase them down. I went home and wrote the same sentence in my notebook that night. Standards don't feel exciting until the day you need them. Now, in that state office building, the same man was standing 10 feet from a project that needed standards like it needed oxygen. I watched him adjust his badge, the motion too smooth. The woman at the front moved through slides. Right now, we have different reporting systems, she said. Different formats, different timelines. We can't see risk early enough. We can't coordinate across agencies. She clicked again. Photos of flood damage, a washed-out access road, a bridge deck with cracks that didn't look dramatic until you understood what they meant. This pilot is about one thing, she said. Getting the same truth in the same language fast enough to act. Lucas leaned closer to me, whispering. Dad, this is real, he said, like he was still testing the word. I kept my eyes on the screen. It's been real. I said. He swallowed and sat back. Then came the part I was waiting for. A gray-haired director from the department cleared his throat and said, We're going to hear from Mr. Cross. There was a pause in the room. Not hostile, just curious. People had expectations when an older man stood up. I stood slowly. My knees didn't make a speech out of it. They just did what knees do. I walked to the front, not too fast, not too careful. I didn't bring a flashy deck. I brought one slide, a diagram, Boxes and arrows. Who reports what? When? In what format? Who signs off? What happens when a piece is missing? Boring on purpose, because boring is what holds up a bridge. I looked at the room and said, I'm not here to sell you magic. A few people smiled. I'm here to give you a system that makes it harder to lie to yourself. The room went quieter. I pointed at the first box. Right now, I said, your field notes, your inspection logs, your weather flags, your contractor updates, they're all telling different versions of the same story. I clicked to the next. This pilot isn't a product, I said. It's a discipline. I saw the three in the back shift. They weren't smiling now. I kept going. If you want a bridge to be safe, I said, you don't start with a headline. You start with a checklist, another click, and if you want an entire state to move as one, I said, you start by making sure everyone uses the same words for the same risks. I let it sit. Then, from the back, a hand went up. It was him, the old school guy. He stood up like he was brave for doing it. Can you clarify, he said, why we need such strict standards? Couldn't this slow innovation? There was a little ripple in the room, that familiar argument. I didn't take it personally. I didn't even look irritated. I said, innovation doesn't mean everybody improvises. He blinked. I went on. Imagine every crew on a job site decides their own way to label a hazard. I said, one crew writes minor, another writes watch, another writes nothing because they don't want to look bad. I pointed at the photo of flood damage. Water doesn't care what you called it, I said. It will take the road anyway. The director nodded once. Slow. The room felt different. Not because I'd won an argument, because reality had entered. After the briefing, people stood around in little circles. That's what they always do. Small talk over big decisions. Lucas hovered close, like he was afraid this could evaporate if he didn't watch it. Elaine spoke quietly with a woman from procurement, taking notes on her phone. Hannah watched faces, reading what wasn't said. Then I felt someone step beside me. Mr. Cross, a voice said. I turned. It was him, up close now. He held his laptop like a shield. I just wanted to say, that framework, he said, careful with his words. It's solid. I nodded once. He cleared his throat. Would you be willing, he said, to send me your deck or maybe do a deeper walkthrough for our team? There it was. Not an apology, not a confession, a request. I looked at him for a moment. Not long enough to be cruel, long enough to be honest? Sure, I said. I can do a walkthrough. Relief flashed across his face. Then I added, calm. But you're going to do it the right way. His smile tightened. What do you mean, he asked. I gestured toward the printed agenda on the table. You follow the chain, I said. You document decisions, you assign owners, you put it in writing. He nodded quickly. I watched him nod and thought about all the things people worship. Fame, buzzwords, confidence. None of that patches concrete. None of that keeps a bridge standing when the river rises. What keeps it standing is boring. Process, standards, accountability. I didn't feel victory. I felt something cleaner, a kind of quiet proof, because the truth is, reputation can't fix a bridge. A system can, and for the first time in a long time, the room wasn't asking me to be smaller. It was asking me to be precise. The first thing Lucas did after that briefing wasn't hug me. He didn't say, I'm proud of you, or any of the lines people reach for when they're trying to fix a mess with a sentence. He drove us home in silence. His hand stayed tight on the wheel. 10 and 2, like he was learning to drive all over again. When we pulled into the driveway, he didn't go inside right away. He stood by his car and stared at the house like it was a job site with a crack running through the foundation. "Dad," he said, "finally, I need you to hear something." I waited, not because I was trying to punish him, because I'd learned that when people are finally ready to talk, you don't rush them. He reached into the passenger seat and pulled out a folder. A real folder, not a phone, not a link. Paper. He held it out like it weighed more than it should. "I'm not going to apologize the way I usually do," he said. "I'm not good at that." I almost laughed, but I didn't. He opened the folder. Inside were printouts, a simple plan, bullet points, a timeline. He'd titled it, "Project Comms plus Family Boundaries." He cleared his throat. "I talked to a friend in PR," he said, "and I talked to the agency contact we met today. I asked them what happens to guys like you. I didn't move." "What do you mean?" "Guys like me," I asked. "The older expert," he said, eyes fixed on the driveway. "The person everyone suddenly needs, but nobody actually protects." He flipped to the first page. "This is what I'm going to do," he said, and his voice steadied a little. "I'm going to be the point person for media and questions. Not you. If anyone wants a comment, they go through me." He tapped the paper. "I'm setting up a separate email address for press. A website with the basics. A one-page bio. Simple. Clean. No hype. Just facts." He looked at me, like he expected me to swat it away. I didn't. He kept going. "I'm also writing a memo," he said. "For the team, for the contractors, for whoever wants to credit the work later. It's going to say what you built, what you own, and what decisions require your sign-off." He said sign-off like he'd borrowed my language on purpose. "And," he added, "I'm not asking you to be nicer. I'm asking you to be protected." That word landed. Protected. Not praised, not celebrated. Protected. It was the first responsible thing he'd said about me in a long time. Hannah came out onto the porch then. No dramatic entrance. She held her phone, but she wasn't scrolling. She was listening. "I have something too," she said. Lucas stepped aside, still holding the folder. Hannah walked down the steps and stood a few feet away from me, like she didn't want to crowd my air. "I read the pilot summary," she said. "I read the parts they don't put in the headlines." I waited again. She nodded toward the street. "You know who gets hurt first when infrastructure fails?" she asked. "It's not the people with options." She said options like it was a real currency. "It's the families who can't leave." She continued. "The older folks who can't drive at night. The people working 2 jobs who don't have time to file reports. The neighborhoods that already get ignored until something breaks." Lucas looked down at his folder, like he hadn't thought that far. Hannah did. "If this project is about one language for risk," she said, "then it has to be readable. It has to be accessible, not just for engineers, for the public." She took a breath. "Because if a system gets too shiny and too closed," she said, "it stops being safety. It becomes control." Elaine opened the front door behind her. She didn't say anything from the doorway. She just stood there for a second, taking in her children standing in the yard like they were finally trying to build something instead of argue about it. Then she walked down slowly. She had her keys in her hand, not her phone. "I went to the community college today," she said. Lucas turned. What he asked? Elaine nodded. Small and firm. "They have a basic digital skills course," she said. 2 nights a week. Hannah blinked. Elaine looked at me. "I'm not doing it to become an expert," she said. I'm doing it because I realized something." She swallowed, and her voice almost broke, but she kept it controlled. "I've been living next to your world like it's behind glass," she said. "I say I support you, but I don't step inside it." She held up her keys. "So I enrolled." She said, "I start Monday. No speech, no grand apology, a decision." I stared at her for a moment. Not because I didn't believe her, because I didn't know what to do with effort that wasn't wrapped in guilt. We stood there in the driveway, all of us, the house behind us, the garage to the side, the shed door still slightly crooked from winter swelling, and it hit me that this was what repair actually looked like. Not one emotional dinner where everyone cries and hugs and promises to do better. That kind of peace is cheap. It fades by morning. Real repair looked like Lucas writing down a plan and putting his name on it. It looked like Hannah asking who gets hurt when systems fail. It looked like Elaine showing up to a class she didn't have to take. A family doesn't need fake harmony. A family needs a mechanism for respect. A way to make sure the loudest person doesn't always win. A way to make sure the quietest person doesn't disappear. Lucas slid the folder toward me again. "Can we do this?" he asked. "Can we rebuild it the right way I didn't say yes right away?" I took the folder. I felt the paper in my hands. Then I nodded once. "We can," I said, "but we do it like a project." Lucas let out a breath. Hannah smiled. "Just a little." Elaine looked past us at the garage, then back at me. "And you tell us what you're building," she said. "Even if we don't understand it at first." I held her gaze. "That's the deal," I said. And for the first time in a long time, the next step didn't feel like a fight. It felt like work. A week after the briefing, the house looked normal again. Same driveway, same porch light, same quiet neighborhood where nothing dramatic ever seems to happen. That's the part people don't tell you. Big moments don't fix a family. They just expose what was already there. I still woke up early. I still made coffee the same way. 2 scoops, no sugar. I still walked past the dining table where Elaine had said, "Maybe it's easier if you stay home." The table didn't change. We did. Slowly. Lucas kept doing what he promised. He screened calls. He kept my name out of places where it would turn into a headline. Hannah sent me articles about public accountability and safety systems. Not to impress me, but to stay in the room with me. Elaine went to her class twice a week. She came home with a notebook and a look on her face like she'd been in a foreign country. Sometimes she'd sit at the kitchen counter and ask, "What does this mean?" Not because she wanted to manage me, because she didn't want to be outside my life anymore. And still there were quiet moments that scared me. Because I'd learned the wrong lesson for a long time. I used to think silence meant we were fine. No shouting, no slammed doors, no blow-ups at the table. So I told myself it was peace. But I've started noticing something. In a lot of families, the quiet doesn't happen because everyone feels heard. The quiet happens when one person gets tired of proving their right to speak. They don't stop having thoughts. They stop offering them. They stop correcting the plan. They stop asking questions. They stop saying, "That won't work," because they've learned what comes next. The sigh, the eye roll, the label, difficult, stubborn, negative. It's a clean way to make someone smaller without ever saying, "We don't need you." And that's the part that should scare you. Not conflict, erasure, because when a person goes quiet in their own home, people call it keeping the peace. What it really is a slow kind of exile. I didn't get rescued by money. The contract didn't give me a soul. It just put a spotlight on what had been true for years. I wasn't invisible because I lacked value. I was invisible because we all got used to a version of family where my value didn't need to be acknowledged. And I'll be honest, there's a bitterness in realizing how late respect can arrive. How often it shows up only after you've been priced. But here's what I know now. Respect isn't a prize you hand someone when they finally impress you. It's the minimum payment you owe a human being when you share a life with them. So if this story hit you in the chest, don't wait for a headline in your own house. Don't wait for someone to prove they matter. Think of the person in your family who's been getting quieter, the one who used to argue, and now just nods. The one who sits at the edge of the room and says, "Whatever you want, call them." Or walk into the room they always disappear into, and ask one simple question like you mean it. "Hey, what are you building these days?"